patience. It was hard to see through the fog, but there it was. They had arrived at the hospital. After an exchange of victorious sighs and waking those who had fallen asleep, the students came out of the car and stood in the road, groaning and stretching. "My God, it feels like we were in that stupid car for centuries," said Kwang. "Don't make fun of my mother's car," came Lai's reply as she closed the driver door. After a sigh, she tapped on Tam's shoulder, who had been leaning against the car with her eyes closed. "Hey!" Kwang yelled. "Don't you go back to sleep. It was hard enough to get you up." Fine, can we just go?" she begged. "I need more sleep if we're going to be starting tomorrow." Lai pressed her keys and the car beeped, and the girls set off for the hospital. Even 20 yards in front of them, the building could hardly be seen through the fog. The only thing giving away its position was the glowing red cross in the air above them. The dark of the night made visibility low, but the moon and the fog allowed them just enough light to see once the headlights were switched off. They trudged up the dirt path, the heavy bags on their backs, ruining any enjoyment from the chance to stretch their legs. "Did we really have to come here?" Tam asked the others, who shook their heads already at her whining. "I want to sleep in a proper bed before I might never get a chance to again. Our final night as free young women, and I don't even get a good sleep." "The cottages are another 30 minutes into town," Kwang said. "Do you really want to get back in the car now?" Tam groaned, throwing her head back. "Besides," Lai began, "they offered for us to stay the night. We must be polite." Her voice was so soft and quiet, it was almost swept away into the fog. Tam paid no notice, but Kwang hung on to the words, frowning. "Whatever," Tam blurted. "It's freezing out here. Let's just get inside." As they approached the hospital, its picture did not become clearer. The fog seemed to grow thicker, and the darkness darker, until they could only see the large doors waiting for them, a small glowing red Tao Hospital sign above them. Kwang stepped forward and wrenched the heavy door open, grunting as it croaked open, and became an enormous, deep black mouth in the building. The students entered without hesitation in order to escape the cold, finding themselves standing in the middle of a small, dark, and wooden room. The walls, floor, ceiling, and what must have been a reception desk were all made of old, graying, splintering wood covered in dust. The dust swept through the air just like the fog that had enveloped the girls outside. They looked around, questions flooding their minds. Kwang set down her suitcase and walked to the counter, peering behind it. She exchanged incredulous glances with the other girls and threw her eyes around the scene. It was not a large room, just 4 thick, old wooden walls and the counter. Kwang went to speak, but inhaled dust and instead coughed violently a few times. Lai came to pat her back as Tam kept searching around the room, running her hands along the walls and collecting dust. Having recovered, Kwang spoke. "What the hell is going on?" with a kink still in her throat. "Ouch!" Tam yelped, pulling her finger away from the wall to see a thick splinter sticking out of it. "What is this place? Are you kidding me?" Kwang kept filling the room with questions. Mixed with the dust, the room was so cloudy, Lai could barely think over it all. Tam pulled the splinter out of her finger with a grimace, and a heavy drop of blood trickled out and down to her wrist. A door opened loudly from the rightmost wall, crashing into the wall as it swung. Lai squinted through the dust at the door she swore she had not noticed, and then saw a nurse standing in the doorway. The woman was not old, but older than the students, and was adorned in a breathtaking white, traditional dress. with graceful golden and pink flowers that seemed to crawl up her body. It fit perfectly and seemed to draw light into the reception, or maybe the light had just come from the open door. Lai stopped squinting once she realized that she no longer needed to. The force of the opening door must have cleared the dust somewhat. The nurse, this was only assumed, since this traditional dress looked quite different to the scrubs the students were used to wearing, smiled warmly and bowed to the girls, who stood in the middle of the room staring stupidly. She approached them, her steps so graceful and silent they were unnoticeable, her old-fashioned cheongsam flowing behind her. She moved straight towards Lai, who was the most central in the room. Stopping before her, the woman bowed again, and then stood smiling for a second, as Lai watched speechlessly. She looked over her shoulder at Kwang, who flashed her eyes and nodded towards the lady. Nervous, Lai spoke. "Hi there. The woman then spoke, formally greeting them. The students exchanged confused looks. "Was that Chinese?" Kwang asked the others. The woman looked at her, her smile still holding, and then moved on to smile at the others. Lai was still, and Tam shrugged her shoulders when Kwang looked to her for any kind of help. The woman continued speaking Chinese, falling on deaf ears. Kwang tried to catch Lai's attention, but the young girl was standing perfectly still and silent, looking to be in awe of the traditionally clothed mystery nurse. Kwang sighed and stepped out from behind the desk, smiling briefly before it fell. "Excuse me, we don't understand Chinese. Do you not speak Vietnamese?" The woman looked at her. Her smile held, but wavered as she had been interrupted mid-sentence. She stared at Kwang, who stared back, and her eyes seemed to tear through her. Kwang finally broke the eye contact as her head began to pound softly, just a few times. "What do we do?" Tam asked, and everyone in the room looked at her. "I mean, what's going on?" "I have no idea," Kwang said, her voice weak and worn out. She joined the others in silence for a moment, but then her eyes lit up and she looked at her friend. "That's right. Lai, your name, it's Chinese, isn't it?" Lai met her eyes, but remained silent as her head grappled with the scene. "Right? Lai? Yes, it means future," she breathed. "Good." Kwang almost jumped in her place. "So is your mother Chinese? Do you speak any Chinese? Any at all?" Kwang and Tam leaned closer, though they were each a few steps away. Even the woman seemed to lean in, keen to hear Lai's words. Lai's mind raced, even though she knew the answer. Without a miracle, she said, "No." "Great. That's just great," Kwang exclaimed, as Tam sighed and looked around the room as if a Chinese-Vietnamese dictionary may have appeared on the desk. Kwang sat down on the desk, audibly sighing too, and shaking her head as the woman regarded them all with just as much confusion as they extended her. "Well, what the hell are we going to do? What was the school thinking, sending us to a village that doesn't speak Vietnamese? And why? What the hell is this place?" No one answered, and the woman seemed to grow impatient, her smile fading as she darted her eyes between the three and waited for a response she could understand. The girls slowly shrunk into themselves, Kwang desperately searching for a way out. She reached for her phone in her pocket, but felt only denim. "Excuse me," Lai said in English, cutting through the silence. "Do you speak English?" The woman's face lit up, and she smiled again at Lai, nodding with bared teeth. Kwang and Tam sighed with relief, throwing their heads back. "Oh, thank God," Kwang said, smiling as well. "Yes," the nurse half shouted. "Good." She stared at the girls and thought for a second, but then her expression wavered. She powered on and spread her arms in a welcoming manner. "Good," she said with a smile, bowing again. "What is that? Is she welcoming us?" Tam asked pointlessly. "How much English can you speak?" Lai asked, her voice firmer this time. "Yes," the nurse beamed. "Very good." She smiled, and Kwang closed her eyes. "Great. She can't speak English either. Now what do we do?" Lai looked around as the woman waited for her response. Tam shook her head and threw her hands up. "Maybe we should just leave. This isn't going to work. We should go to our housing for the night, call the school in the morning and drive back." "I think that's a good idea," Kwang agreed, and they each looked to Lai. She put a hand on her chest, catching the woman's attention, and said slowly, "Me, Lai." The woman smiled wide and put a hand to her own chest. Her skin was like porcelain, a shining pale white in the dim room. "Ai Chiao," the woman said, and Lai smiled. "Nurse?" Lai screwed up her face and pointed at the woman. "Sorry, nurse." The woman nodded, said, "Nurse Chiao," and bowed once again. "We can make do," Lai suggested. "It should be okay." "We're supposed to learn while we're here," Kwang argued. "How can we do that if we can't even speak to them?" "Learning is mostly practical," Lai said back ever so softly. "Can we just see how it goes? It would be rude to leave now. What do you think, Tam?" Both girls looked to Tam, who bit her lip and stared at her shuffling feet. She shrugged, and Kwang sighed. Fine," Kwang groaned, and she headed to the middle of the room with her suitcase. Lai raised her eyebrows and gestured at the door Nurse Chiao had entered through, and the nurse nodded and copied the gesture. After moving toward it, she stopped and pointed at the girls' cases, then at the wall beside the door. After leaving their bags, the group headed through the door, which fell closed behind them. They began walking down a very dark corridor, the same old strange wood that the reception seemed to be made of. It looked extremely primitive, a far cry from the sterile white and silvers of the Medical University Hospital back home. The corridor was dark enough, and the dust and fog had returned to prohibit clear vision, so much so that the end of the corridor was completely shrouded in darkness. Lai could not see more than a few meters in front of her, and the girls shared nervous glances as they blindly followed Nurse Chiao. After minutes had passed, the dust seemed to thicken, and the air thin. Breathing became harder. The darkness grew darker. It was unclear just how long it had been. The corridor seemed to continue forever, turning left and right again, never crossing, just growing darker and dustier. Kwang wondered about asking just how long this corridor was, but the thought barely made it to her mouth before she coughed in the dust and forgot it altogether, focusing on trying to breathe successfully. The same thought entered and exited Tam's mind, as she too coughed and scratched at her neck as it began to feel like it was closing up. Lai blinked through the thick dust as her feet stumbled over one another, almost causing her to trip a couple of times. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead elicited a pant and hung her head. It was spinning, her eyes glazing over. After 10 minutes or 30, Lai could not be sure. She gulped hard and tapped the nurse on the shoulder, almost falling into her, and asked, "Are we almost there?" Nurse Chiao turned around and smiled, her perfect white teeth blaring in Lai's eyes. "Yes." Another few steps forward, and they reached the end of the corridor, the nurse opening a wooden door before them. A sudden gush of air entered the corridor, and the girls could breathe again, almost stumbling as they bent over and panted. The nurse waited patiently, always smiling, until the students were ready, and they then followed her into a small, empty room. There were no further doors in this strange-smelling room, only the same dark, splintering wood as the rest of the hospital. The nurse glided over to the opposite corner of the room, where a black curtain hung from about halfway down the wall to the floor. The girls took a step inside and looked curiously around the small room that had seemingly no purpose, as Chiao crouched down at the curtain and poked her head through it. Lai watched her, looking closely, and heard the faintest of Chinese whispers before Chiao stood again. She addressed the group of girls, waving a hand at the curtain, this doctor. The girls stared at the curtain in wait, and for a second there was nothing, until it rustled and then blew aside, 2 legs sliding out. They found their footing, and the rest of an older man's body soon followed, until he was standing by the curtain. As it blew back over the hole in the wall, Lai caught a tiny glimpse inside, but could only see impenetrable black darkness, as if there was no space behind the curtain at all. The doctor was quite short, shorter than Chiao, and much shorter than Kwang, who stood taller than everyone. He was thin, with thinning gray hair, and he wore a male version of the white traditional dress that adorned Nurse Chiao, along with a small pair of circular glasses. He smiled weakly at the students and bowed. "Welcome, Tao Hospital," he rasped, his voice old and weak. "I am Dr. Heng. I show you. Tour," he offered, gesturing to the door. "Great, not creepy at all," Kwang said under her breath, and Tom hit her arm. Dr. Heng walked across the room, Nurse Chiao gliding beside him, and they lead the group through the door and back into the dreaded corridor. This time, though, there was another door directly across from the doctor's office, which Heng stopped in front of to turn around. "This non-contagious area, please." He gently opened the door and entered, Kwang gulping as she followed. Tam followed after, Nurse Chiao standing at the door to hold it open. Lai walked towards it, but caught the corridor out of the corner of her eye. Looking to her right, in the direction they had come from, she saw that it ended with a single door only 10 meters away. She furrowed her brow and met Nurse Chiao's eyes, who was smiling as she always was, her eyes unsettlingly wide. "Please," Chiao said, and Lai bowed and entered the door. Nurse Chiao blinked for a long time, tears streaming from her eyes, before she opened her eyes wide again and followed the others through the door, slamming it shut behind her. They found themselves in a long, wide room, the biggest they had been in yet, and it was full of patients. Lined along the floor on each side of a clear path through the middle were countless bodies. At first glance, the students gagged and recoiled. It looked like a mass grave. The bodies lining the room were black, unmoving, silent. Was it a trick of the light? It seemed as if the darkness of the place had crept into the skin of the infirmed. Kwang's lip trembled as she looked at the line of bodies, these black corpses, and felt a stirring in her empty stomach. Dr. Heng replied to the girl's shock with confusion and walked over to poke one of the bodies with his foot. Tam almost screamed as he did, throwing her hand up to stop him, inexplicably but absolutely terrified of what might happen. It appeared that these were not corpses. The black body laying below quietly groaned and began to move, slowly rocking back and forth. Kwang screwed up her face and looked closer, seeing that the 40 or so bodies were each lying uncovered on a thin straw mat, but they too were dirty with whatever black matter covered the patients. She could not tell if they were naked on their beds, or whether their clothes had just gotten as dirty as their skin. "What the fuck is going on?" she whispered to her friends, Lai giving her wide eyes of admonishment. Dr. Heng also gave Kwang a disapproving look, But for some reason, his blank stare was much, much scarier than Lai's frantic shock. It filled Quang with a deep dread as she wondered if he spoke Vietnamese, sure that he did not. This dread soon crept into the other girls as the body beside the poked one began to groan and move as well, and then the next body and the next. After a few moments, the entire room of patients were swaying and moaning their sickening, low grumble. Tam began to breathe faster and faster, almost hyperventilating, as Quang continued to stare straight down and shrink into herself, and Lai's eyes desperately darted around the room, looking at each of the moving bodies. Sensing their uncomfortableness, Dr. Heng smiled professionally and gestured at the door at the other end of the room. "Come, the contagious area," he said, and began to walk down the path of clear floor down the middle of the room. The girls quickly followed him, Tam having to push Quang in her catatonic state, and Nurse Chow moving at the back of the line. Lai and Tom walked as quickly and quietly as they could, trying to be silent as their shoes tapped on the soft wooden floor. Almost to the door, Tam just spotted in the bottom of her field of view as 5 peeling gray digits reached out onto the path and draped across her foot. She yelped and jumped into the air as the ice-cold black hand gripped her ankle, causing Lai and Quang to jump in fright as well. Dr. Heng wheeled around and locked his eyes onto the hand, narrowing them. He met eyes with Chiao and nodded, and she produced a wooden cane and stepped forward to slap the hand. The action was met with a pained cry from the sea of writhing bodies. It was too dark and too intense to tell just whose hand it had been. The situation resolved, Dr. Heng continued to approach the door and stopped just before it at a shelf of white coats and medical masks. He placed one of the white masks over his mouth and nose and motioned for the students to follow him. As they did so, Lai tried her hardest to block out the sounds of the patients behind them, as the moaning seemed to grow louder and louder, more desperate and strained. She felt as if she could hear them growing closer to death, but she was pulled out of her thoughts as Quang tugged on her shoulder to pull her through the door that had since opened. At the back of the group again, Nurse Chow was the last to exit the room, and just before she did, she stopped and looked out over the mass of moving bodies. With a stern look, she stomped down with the cane and let out a hissing shh. From the contagious area, Lai heard as the entire room behind them became silent, and she turned to see, but Nurse Chow had already stepped through and slammed the door shut. Lai's attention was brought back ahead as Quang gagged and said, "Oh my God." Focusing through the darkness, Lai felt the same way. This room was another one lined with bodies, only this room was smaller and had only half the number of patients as the last area. The patients in this room did not look like dark gray corpses. However, they looked a far sight worse. Lai could hardly believe her eyes as she scanned the room, and the images burned into her memory, stinging her retinas. These bodies were pale white in comparison to the last room, and clearly alive as each one breathed loudly, a few sobbing or weeping in different corners of the room. All over the place the white was interrupted by streaks or patches of red, and a closer look made clear the reason. The bodies, every one of them, were covered in horrific lacerations and gashes. Whether they were wounds or medical incisions, it did not matter. The sight of them paled in comparison to the insects. Spiders, flies, maggots, everything, crawling over the injuries. Lai covered her mouth with her hand, burping uncontrollably when she saw them. Quang coughed and audibly gagged, holding onto Tam to brace herself. Tam stood in a shocked stillness, her eyes glossing over and trying to block as much vision as possible. Nurse Chiao and Dr. Hung shared concerned looks as the students struggled to remain standing in the middle of the room. The walls seemed to be drawing in around them, the bodies moving closer, and difficulty to breathe came again. The white masks made breathing even more difficult and made Kwang lightheaded as her warm breath filled the mask and contributed to her claustrophobia. She grabbed at it and pulled it down, but her nose was immediately hit with a horrible stench, and she found herself on the verge of throwing up. Slamming the mask back to her face, she closed her eyes and quietly prayed to herself. Tam's eyes pleaded with Lai, who panted, almost whimpering, and tapped the doctor on the shoulder. "Can we please go? Can we please move on?" she begged, and he held her shoulders to keep her upright. "It is okay. Be calm. We will go." He walked to the other end of the room and pushed the door open, calling for the girls to follow. Nurse Chiao shook her head and tut-tut-tutted, but Lai barely registered it as a real sound as she ran for the door. Her friends followed, and they bounded out of the room, their eyes clasped shut, though it did not stop the scuttle of wings and scrape of legs from entering their minds. They stood and fidgeted frantically just outside the door in another corridor, waiting for the door to close, as Nurse Chow stood in the doorway with a blank expression. Dr. Heng said something quick and sharp in Chinese, and she huffed and closed the door, still inside the room. The new corridor fell silent, but quickly became a flurry of noise as the girls panted and removed their masks, throwing them to the floor. Lai stopped to pick them up and pile them by the door as Kwang coughed, almost doubling over. Sorry, Heng offered, trying to help Kwang to her feet, but she pushed him away. No, she breathed. Room now, please. Sleep. Good night. Dr. Heng's face became apologetic, and he looked between the other girls for guidance. You are not hungry? Noticing his expression, Lai sighed and shook her head, embracing Kwang as she spoke to Hung. It's okay. Yes, we are hungry. Thank you, Doctor. The doctor hung his head and led them down the new corridor, which was the first to be lit overhead with actual lights, though they were still very dim and did not look to be electrical. The dust seemed to have settled, and breathing was easy after the ordeal of the contagious area. At the end of the corridor, Lai could make out a body on the wall, and her brain began to fire up in panic again. Her panic faded soon, however, as Heng stopped before the end of the corridor and gestured to the pristine body of an old man behind glass. His voice was weaker than before, with clear strain. This director, King Zhao, means clear illumination and understanding. He is dead. Yeah, great, thank you. Kwang dismissed the doctor's faint words. But as she looked up with tired eyes and saw the man behind the glass, her green face turned pale. Meeting his eyes struck something deep inside her as she stared into the dark cabinet, and her brain tried to decide whether it was an extremely realistic wax figure or an incredibly well-preserved corpse. The deep black eyes of the director seemed to terrify and calm the students simultaneously, or at the very least, it sedated them. Dr. Heng smiled with a weak pride before quickly moving off to the right and through two heavy wooden doors. The girls followed one by one, finding it difficult to tear their eyes away. Lai lingered, running her eyes up and down the man's body. Across the sword hung beside him the nameplate and plaque in Chinese, the flowing red and gold silk backdrop. It was only when the doors were about to swing closed that she tore away from the sight and followed her friends into the other room. Kwang and Tom were already seated at a small wooden table in the center of the room with 2 wooden benches on either side. It was another large room, maybe the same size as the non-contagious area, and was filled with the same tables and bench-like seats. Hung stood beside the table and welcomed Lai, and Nurse Chow sat across from the 2 students. "This cafeteria," Heng croaked. "You eat here." Lai bowed and squeaked, "Thank you," in what she hoped was a passable Chinese before rushing to the table, forced to sit beside the nurse and across from Tam. They sat in silence for a while, hesitating to look up from the table as they shifted in their seats and creaked the wooden benches. "You 2 okay?" Lai asked in their native tongue, and Kwang and Tom looked up gravely. A door banged open, and Nurse Chow smiled, saying, "Ah, good," in her pleasantly shrill English. The students followed her eyes to the door, where Heng was walking over with a smile and a wooden tray of plates. One of the girls' stomachs grumbled as the food approached, and they shared a relieving giggle before the plates were placed before them, and Lai's stomach dropped. Kwang exclaimed with hunger, and Tam was hesitant, but weakly offered thanks, while Lai stared at the meal with wide eyes and a sinking hope. It was meat, but it looked to be raw. This bright red and white meat heaped onto the plate with a smattering of spices and herbs. Chopsticks fell beside each plate, and the others picked them up and feverishly tucked in as Lai gulped and stared. Crickets. Nurse Chow smiled at the 2 eaters, then swiveled around to judge Lai. The girl gulped and burped uncontrollably, infrequently at first, but then it became regular. Weevils. She blinked rapidly and clutched at her stomach as her friend scoffed down the bright meat and moaned. Nurse Chow was watching with wide, hungry eyes, her smile just as wide, starving, full of teeth. "You like it?" she asked in her high voice, and Kwang nodded, wiping some red sauce from her chin. "Yeah, wow, it's actually really good," she said, then looked down and poked at it. "What is it?" All 3 girls waited for the nurse's response, but she only continued to smile and repeated, "Yes, you like it?" Kwang chuckled, and then glanced at Tam in her peripherals, her laugh becoming nervous. "What meat is it?" she asked, and Nurse Chow nodded with pride. "You like it? Good." Lai could feel her 8-hour-old lunch begin to rise, coming dangerously close to the top of her throat. Spiders. She coughed and spluttered and had to throw her hand down on the table to brace herself as her mouth continued to burp, then hiccup. Tam and Kwang chuckled again at her, and Tam patted her arm. "Are you okay, Lai? You look like you're about to die," she said, and Kwang hit her on the arm and laughed before digging back into her meat. Lai closed her eyes and tried to block out the squelching sound of the meat tearing apart between Kwang's teeth, but it did not help. The darkness only amplified the sound as it mixed with the images in her head. Worms, cuts, bodies. "Nurse Chow?" Tam asked, once Lai would not answer. The nurse whipped her head to meet her gaze, almost cracking her neck with the speed. "What is the meat? It's delicious, but what is it?" The woman let out a sudden brief laugh, then clasped a hand over her mouth. "Sorry, yes. You like it?" Tam sighed and shook her head, picking up her chopsticks again to continue. The nurse kept watching, her eyes fixed on the girls' mouths. Lai watched the strange woman as she stared, glued to the feeding students. "I made it myself," she then said, and Lai's vision began to flash black and white. Flies. Tam bit into a slab, smearing red over her mouth. Larvae. Kwang took a succulent bite and cooed to the taste, her eyes rolling back. Maggots. Nurse Chiao giggled, and Lai's head became hot, her vision darkened, and she suddenly fell forward and slammed into the table. She woke staring at a vast wooden plane, stretching as far as her dim eyes could travel. It was cracked, peeling. Cobwebs hung from it. It was a deep, dark wood, pulling her attention into the flat wooden planks. A figure suddenly obscured the ceiling, a dark figure wearing a long black overcoat. As her eyes focused on the blurry image, she squealed and tried to scramble away. The figure staring down at her, below its round black hat, had the face of a bird, a small, rounded face with sunken reflective eyes, and a long, curved, sharp beak pointing down at Lai's heart. She scuttled backwards on the floor, sticking splinters into her legs and back, until she hit a table behind her. Kwang and Tam entered her vision from the right, rushing over and bending down to hold her. "It's okay, it's all right," Tam yelled as she rubbed Lai's back. "Are you okay?" "What the hell happened?" Kwang asked. Dr. Hung and Nurse Chiao entered from the left, standing with their hands behind their backs, solemnly looking down. The doctor had his usual worried face underneath the small, beady glasses, and the nurse held a perfectly blank expression, almost as if unimpressed. After surveying them, Lai remembered her fright and quickly focused her vision back on the figure right in front of her. Her vision clearer now, she could see that it was not a 6-foot raven, but rather a man in a black shawl with an old-looking wide-brimmed hat and a peculiar wooden bird mask. It sent chills down Lai's spine and caused her body to physically jolt, her heartbeat increasing a little as the bird mask's tiny glass eyes peered down at her. They were encircled with dull metal sockets, and the beak was the same rusty gray metal at the base, and the tip with a black wooden shaft. She had seen this kind of outfit and mask somewhere, but where was it? "This Mr. K.E., Dr. Heng said, gesturing to the unsettling man in black. "He is groundskeeper, maintenance. Sorry if he frightened you." Dr. Heng bowed as Lai stared back at Mr. K.E., who stared back in perfect stillness. He then leaned down and extended his large, leather-gloved hand, and Lai hesitated for a moment before taking it. He helped her to her feet, and she gasped at how easily he lifted her whole weight. He let go as soon as she was stable, and then stomped away with his clinking metal boots to the nearest door, exiting without a word. Lai took a deep breath and blew it back out as Kwang and Tam closed in around her. "You sure you're all right?" Tam asked, and Lai nodded. "I think we're going to our room now. Dinner's finished." Lai looked over at the center of the room and saw that their table had been upended, one end hanging off the floor, and the plates of meat spilled on the ground. "Oh," she gasped, putting a hand on Kwang's shoulder. "I'm so sorry." "It is okay," Dr. Heng offered, smiling his strained smile, waving his hands at the table. "No problem. Now to your room." He took a step back and motioned to the door that Mr. K.E. had disappeared through. The girls followed him, Lai hanging her head as she staggered over and leaned on Kwang's shoulder. They passed through the door and walked for a minute, Lai looking down at the scraped wooden floors and taking in none of her surroundings. As she was half-dragged along, her stomach grumbling unhappily, she noticed as the dark brown floor seemed to become a reddish brown, and screwed her face up. There seemed to be huge gaps and gashes in the wood as well, like it had been chipped at. The red grew thicker and brighter, and she opened her eyes wider to observe it. Then, "Here," Dr. Heng said, drawing Lai's vision. He pushed a large rusty key into a wooden door and pushed it open, leading into a dark room. Tam gulped and shared a worried glance with Kwang, but the doctor's desperate little smile prompted them to bow and enter the room. "Thank you, doctor," Lai offered. "I'm very sorry." Hung shook his head and smiled. "No sorry, please. You are finally here." He bent down slightly, arching his short, crooked spine, and smiled with teeth. In perfect Vietnamese, he said, "Little future." He smiled, unblinking, and Lai stared into his eyes from the doorway. She furrowed her brow. He still had not blinked. He still smiled wide with his sharp teeth. "What?" she asked. But the door began to creak, louder and louder, and in a second it had slammed shut and shrouded the room in darkness. Kwang yelped from the opposite corner, and something heavy fell to the floor. Lai kept still, looking at the door even in the pitch black. There were heavy footsteps, Tam cursed, and then glass and metal scraped and twisted. The room carefully faded into light as Tam held up a lantern she had found by the bed. Kwang held a hand to her chest and sighed, falling down onto the bed with a thump. Feeling it, she balled her fist and hit the hard, paper-covered wooden bed. "What the hell is with this place?" she tutted, exasperated. She picked at the thin wool blanket thrown over the bed. "I've never been to a village this primitive. I mean, this doesn't make any sense." The walls were peeling and splintering, though this room felt slightly cleaner and less lived in than the others they had been in. There was no window, only 3 small beds and a small table beside each one. Kwang noticed Lai standing at the door. "Hey, what's your problem?" "You okay, Rabbit?" Lai turned around and stared blankly, then walked over to sit on the bed closest to the door. Tam joined the others and sat on the central bed, placing the lantern down on her bedside table. "I'm okay," Lai whispered. "Well, I'm not," Kwang shouted. "I can't fucking believe this. I mean, what is this? Do you understand what this is?" "Kwang, be quiet," Tam warned. "What if they hear you? Who cares? They don't even speak Vietnamese. This is rural Vietnam, and they don't speak Vietnamese." "What?" "They might," Lai said, and felt the others stare at her. "I mean, I don't know. Just be quiet." She lay down on her bed and turned away from them, staring at the wall. Kwang gasped and fell onto her back, staring at the ceiling. "This is a nightmare," she whined, taking off her glasses to rub her eyes. "This can't be real. I'm still in that stupid car, still deep asleep, and dreaming about arriving at this shitty hospital. This cannot be real." "Don't make fun of my mother's car," Lai muffled through the blanket. "I mean, think about what has happened so far," Kwang continued. "It feels unreal, doesn't it? This has got to be some kind of joke. Yes, that's it. I bet someone at the university is playing a joke on us." "Really?" Tam asked, also laying down on the uncomfortably flat bed. "You think someone from school built a whole hospital out of wood and hired all these actors to trick us?" Kwang punched the wooden bed. "Damn it. Well then, how do you explain this? It's too bizarre." "How about we just be quiet and go to sleep?" Lai pleaded, covering her ears. "We can freak out in the morning." Kwang's eyes lit up, and she looked down the side of her bed. Upon looking, she gasped and jumped up onto her knees. "Wait," she breathed, scrambling to the other side and stretching down to look under it. "Where are our bags? All our stuff? I need to change into my PJs." Tam frowned and looked around too, finding nothing. No, where are they? Did we leave them at the reception? Why didn't they bring them here?" "Just go to sleep, please," Lai begged, tears in her eyes. "You can go to sleep, Lai," Kwang shot back, scowling. "They have my stuff hostage." I'm going out to talk to someone. She stood up and stomped over to the door, Lai holding the sides of her head and gritting her teeth as she pressed inwards. Tam frowned at her and leaned over to offer her hand. But as Kwang reached for the door handle, it twisted in front of her, and she jumped back with a shriek. The door opened, and Nurse Chow stood, regarding Kwang strangely as she cowered in the corner and panted. "Sorry," Kwang breathed, but Nurse Chow disregarded her and pointed at Tam. "You," she said. Tam pointed at herself. "Me? Yes, you." The nurse moved into the room and grabbed Tam's forearm. "Help, doctor, come, come." "Doctor needs help?" Tam asked, and looked desperately to Lai and Kwang, as Chow pulled her from the room. Yes, good. Come." Chow continued into the hallway, as she pulled the door closed behind them, and their voices became faint. Lai watched from her bed as the door closed, left with one final image of Tam's face in discomfort and confusion, begging Lai for help. A sickness came to her stomach, and she held it, wondering if it was hunger. "Great!" Kwang yelled from her corner, now standing up. "Now Tam's gone, and I'm stuck with little Miss Polite." "Kwang," Lai softly echoed across the small room, sitting up on the bed. "Will you please just calm down? We'll both just take a deep breath, sit for a minute, and everything will be okay. We can find our things in the morning. Maybe things will seem a lot simpler in the daylight. Just calm down." Kwang sighed and looked at her feet, seeming to be calm. Lai smiled weakly and went to lay down again, but Kwang stamped her foot and walked over to her bed. "No," she said. "I'm going to call the university. This is outrageous. I don't feel comfortable in this place." She reached into her pocket, but felt nothing, frowning. "I want to find out what is going on here." She ran her hand over the bed and in the blanket, but found nothing. "And see if there has been some kind of mix-up." She bent down and looked under the bed, finding her phone directly beneath it. There, it must have fallen out of my pocket when I sat down. She plopped down on the bed and opened her phone, and squealed loud enough to make Lai jump. "What? What is it?" Lai asked, standing up out of the bed. "I don't have any bars," Kwang wailed, violently tapping and swiping at her phone. Lai took a deep breath and sighed, crumpling back down onto the bed. Kwang's breaths became short whimpers as she moved around the room, eventually jumping onto Tam's bed and holding her phone high. "Nothing. God damn this place!" "Shh," Lai shouted in a whisper. "Just shut up. Don't say that." Kwang dropped her hand down and rested her phone. "Okay, I'm sorry," she said, and Lai sobbed under the blanket. Kwang came down and sat beside her, rubbing her shoulder. "Hey, I'm sorry. It's going to be okay, Lai. Just calm down and go to sleep. It'll be all right." "But Tam is. I'll wait up for Tam. Don't you worry. Just go to sleep, Missy." She cooed into Lai's ear and carefully rubbed her arm and sighed. Lai took a deep breath and exhaled, closing her eyes. The rubbing stopped, and she heard Kwang shuffling around behind her, headed back to her bed. There was silence, nothing for a while. Then the door to the room clicked and creaked open. Her eyes shot open, and she bolted to the end of the bed to see, but only saw as the door creaked and closed again with a thud. Looking around, she was alone in the room. Slowly, she crawled back to the head of the bed, covered herself with the blanket, and shivered alone with wide eyes. Kwang tiptoed through the dark halls of the hospital, her phone torch lighting her path, and the screen lighting her face as she held it high up to the ceiling. Come on, she breathed as she went along, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every now and then, something would creak or someone would moan, and she would jump, wondering whether she should head back to the room. Every time she thought about it, though, she would look forward and backwards and could not be sure which way led back, so she pressed on. There was not even a hint of hope, not even a single bar, not even empty bars. Only the message, SOS only, though she had guiltily tried calling emergency services and was not connected. After a while she stopped and looked at the time, 0:14 a.m., and tried to work out how long she had been walking around for. How long had they been there? The thoughts came and went, fuzzy, incomplete. She kept the phone above her head, the screen blinding her as the light showed her way. "Come on, please," she begged, and the phone screen suddenly fell black, the torch going out. "No, no, 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 please, no." She crouched down, tapping at the screen, pressing and holding the power button, whispering desperate prayers she had saved for moments like these. "Please," she whisper-shrieked, but the phone was dead. She fell onto her backside and grumbled, putting the phone into her pocket. The corridor was dark now, but not pitch black. There was light coming from somewhere, and it made the floor and walls only just visible. Kwang stood up in a huff and began walking ahead, then stopped and walked the other way. "Which way did I?" She walked for a second, and then hit something hard, sending her back to the floor, along with a heavy clang a couple of meters in front of her. She darted her eyes up, squinting in the darkness, to see a large figure standing in the middle of the hall. Meanwhile, only a few walls away, Tam stood in a cramped room in a white gown, similar but simpler than the nurses and the doctors. The three of them wore masks and stood at a table with a lantern hanging overhead and giving the room a very dim orange glow. On the table was an unmoving body, one of the contagious patients. Tam held back her feelings as she looked over the body in the dim light. It was a man, naked except for a small cloth over his groin, and he was covered in black bruises and bright red lacerations. There were cuts all over, some tiny and shallow, and some enormous and deep, like he had been hacked. And in every cut, every entrance, there were the insects crawling and squeaking. Tam held her nose even through the mask, trying to block the awful stench. Dr. Heng looked gravely at the body and picked up a small scalpel, grabbing the man by the chest and beginning incision. Tam watched incredulously, holding her chest. "Doctor?" she asked. He and the nurse stared up at her. "No gloves?" The others looked at each other, then back at Tam. "Gloves?" She tried again, motioning the pulling of a glove over her hand. They shrugged and shook their heads, and he continued to slice. Tam covered her mouth and gagged as blood trickled out of the fresh cut. Kwang scrambled to her feet and held her hands out as the figure turned around slowly. "Sorry," she said, laughing. "I didn't see you there. It's so dark in here, and that black coat you have. I'm very sorry." She smiled and shook her head at her clumsiness as the figure turned around to face her. As she met its face, her smile fell, and she almost fell again. A long wooden beak was pointed at her under a wide hat. She stood in shock for a second, then clutched her chest and laughed again. "Oh, I'm sorry again. Mr. K.E., right? Sorry. I wasn't expecting that mask to greet me. I got a fright. Are you okay? Did I hurt you?" Mr. K.E. looked at her down his beak, making no sound or movement. Kwang bit her lip and tapped her foot. "Are you okay? I didn't mean to offend you or anything." He stood still, and she was unsure what to do, looking around for nobody to help. Okay, well, I should get back to my room. It's late. Mr. K.E. turned around and lurched down to pick up whatever had dropped in their collision. Sorry about that. Would you like some help? She leaned over slightly to watch him as he slowly lifted his large body back up. She felt small below his towering figure, inspecting his hat and the back of his mask as he turned around. As he came to face her again, she prepared a warm smile to greet him and hopefully say goodbye. As he turned, however, she noticed a glint in her eye, and she saw as a shining metal edge sweeping towards her. Without time for a scream, Kwang took a huge step back and tumbled over, back to the floor. Above her, Mr. K.E. stopped his swipe, and she saw clearly as he stood over her, with an axe firmly clasped in his giant gloved hands. She panted on the floor in front of him, her glasses out of place on her nose. "Mr. K.E.?" she asked, but he only grunted in response and lifted the axe high above his head as her heart dropped. Tam grimaced as Dr. Heng continued to slice up and down the patient's chest and stomach and tried to block her ears as blood trickled from the body and down the table onto the floor. She swore she could hear the man's throat gurgling a few times as blood trickled from there too. But her frantic questions to the doctor and the nurse fell on deaf ears. Nurse Chiao held a platter of tools, which Dr. Heng grabbed at to open the man's chest and inspect his ribs, sizing up different instruments as if he was unsure how to proceed. Tam refused to look, covering her mouth as she gagged and her stomach flipped. She heard an irregular scraping begin and looked from the corner of her eye to see the doctor's arms sliding erratically back and forth along with the difficult sound. Was he cutting? The scraping continued until a loud crack echoed around the tiny operating room, and she saw as Heng dropped one half of the man's ribcage into a wooden box at his feet. "Doctor," she began, but her voice was drowned out as the cutting started again. She closed her eyes and gritted her teeth as it filled her ears, trying to block the rhythmic sound. It cut forward, then backward, forward, backward, forward, backward, finding a perfect beat. It finally stopped with another crack that caused her whole body to jolt, and he dropped the rest of the ribs into the box. The rhythm continued, though quieter, and Tam raised an eyebrow above her closed eyes. The bone saw clattered loudly down onto Chiao's tray, and Tam yelped as she felt a wet hand on her forearm. She thrust her eyes open and saw that Dr. Heng's bloody hand was directing her towards the body. "No, no!" She tried to squirm away, gagging as his red hands smeared all over her arm. He squeezed her arm, almost cutting off her circulation, and she froze, allowing him to guide her hand to the body. The rhythm was still going, forward, backward, forward, backward. She took a step closer to allow herself to be pulled into the chest cavity, and she saw the heart. It was huge, overgrown, almost bursting, and still pounding. The dim orange light was not poor enough to help her, and she could clearly see the glowing red all over her hands, the doctor's hands, the body, the table. The light seemed to grow dimmer, and then brighter, along with the rhythm, darker, brighter, hurting Tam's eyes. Nurse Chiao giggled as Tam watched in horror, and Heng pulled her hand closer to the heart. She fought back tears as her hand shaped of someone else's volition into a single pointing finger. "Please, stop! He's alive!" she screamed, as the doctor pulled her hand a fraction closer, and the tip of her finger brushed the beating heart. The man's eyes shot open, and he sucked in a gush of air, pulling the flame from the lantern above. The room fell pitch black, and Tam wrenched her hand away The axe came swinging back down, and Kwang barely missed it as she slid back on the floor and stabbed splinters into herself. The axe head hit the wooden floor with a crushing thud and a reverberating twang of metal. Kwang finally found the time to let out a scream before she scrambled to her feet and started to run. Meister K.E. grumbled and wrenched the axe from its place a few inches into the floor. Kwang ran for her life down the hall, feeling her phone come loose in her pocket and fall out. She continued to scream, her flat-soled shoes slapping loudly on the hard wood as she fled. Someone would hear her. Someone would come. She just had to find Lai. Stopping her screaming for a moment, she listened out and could hear clearly the heavy, weighted metal steps of the beast behind her. She began screaming again as she ran into the pitch darkness of the hall ahead of her, until it suddenly stopped being hall and became a turn to the right. Having built up too much momentum, Kwang skidded for a second and then slammed into the wooden wall. She was completely winded as she fell to the floor, her glasses flying somewhere unknown. She barely remembered that Mr. K.E. was running after her with an axe until he was visible right in front of her and was thrusting his axe into the wall a meter above her head. He stopped with no issue and pulled at the axe that had sunk into the wood as Kwang desperately tried to breathe, and her left shoulder burned and pounded in pain. She cried and clawed at the wall, cutting her fingertips as she forcefully pulled herself up and snotted and sobbed onto the floor. "Stop!" she screamed, and Mr. K.E. roared as he pulled at the axe, which finally came out of the wall. She screamed again, the sound broken now by the tears streaming down her face, and she began to run to the right, but Mr. K.E. thrust his axe sideways, and it hooked onto the back of her jumper before sinking into the wall. She let out a strained scream, her voice wavering as her throat began to burn, and thrashed wildly in the opposite direction of the man behind her. As he tried to rip the axe from the wall again, the cut made in Kwang's jumper created a tear all the way up and down its back, ripping it open. The force as she tried to run and finally came free caused her to fall forward, and she threw her hands out to break her fall. Splinters dug into her palms as they scraped along the floor, and she hit the ground, winding her again. Her arms were soaked in tears as she climbed across the floor, her jumper tearing up and falling away, leaving her in just a white t-shirt and jeans. She suddenly felt how cold the hospital was as her hair stood up and goosebumps formed along every inch of exposed skin. She pushed with her bleeding hands and lifted herself up as she heard the axe come out of the wall along with a few chunks of wood. She used her feet to thrust herself forward and continue running blindly, babbling and frantically praying through her tears that she could make it to a room, a door, an exit. Mr. K's heavy footsteps followed behind, cracking the wooden planks underfoot as he stamped along. She threw her head back as she ran, screaming as loud as she could with her mangled vocal cords, but she could hear as Mr. K's steps sped up as hers slowed down. Air whooshed past her head as he lifted the axe above him again, and she looked ahead with a newfound determination. She stopped crying, stopped screaming, gritted her teeth and ran as fast as she could. The axe came down and just barely clipped her, slicing a shallow cut along her back. The touch made her senses overload. She shrieked. Her body suddenly seized up and her legs tangled, sending her to the floor once again. She barely felt the impact as she fell to the ground, and she just looked ahead, though her vision was impaired by her lack of glasses and the glassy film of tears and sweat. He was silent, but she could feel Mr. K.E. standing over her, lifting his axe. She squinted and looked ahead, her vision reaching, and she could just make out the line of light coming from under a door a few meters ahead. Somewhere far behind them, her phone rang, its ringtone echoing through the halls. She felt the air push towards her, and she closed her eyes, flinching as the axe came down and thrust into the flesh of her back. Tam panted against the wall in the cramped room, though the pitch darkness made it seem infinitely large. She heard whispered commands in Chinese and a scraping, fiddling sound, and light suddenly filled the room again as the lantern above was relit. Tam stood with eyes wide, her chest heaving with her breaths, but as the light came back, she saw Dr. Heng and Nurse Chiao looking at her with worry. She looked down at her hands, but they were clean, and so were the doctor's. Darting her eyes to the body on the table, it was a man wrapped in a shawl, rasping quietly. The nurse held an empty syringe, and the doctor was applying an adhesive strip to the man's arm, and they regarded Tam with a shared confusion as she stood and panted. Dr. Heng bowed and thanked her for her help as she looked at her clean arms and at the man on the table. She began, but she never finished, stepping backwards into the hall and rushing back to their quarters. The doctor and the nurse exchanged confused words before shrugging and helping the patient up. Lai twisted and turned on her flat wooden bed, each shuffle rustling the paper beneath her. She groaned in between varied positions, some with the blanket, some without, some on her stomach, and some on her back covering her eyes with her forearm. Is it too hot? She thought, pulling at her cardigan. But then it would suddenly get very cold, and she would scramble for the blanket again. She finally huffed and gave up, staring at the ceiling without the blanket. She reached around for her phone to check the time, as she had a habit of doing at home when she could not sleep, but then remembered she had left it in her suitcase and huffed again. The door clicked, and her heart beat a little faster. She pulled the blanket up over herself as it groaned open. "Kwang?" she asked. Tam stepped into the room and closed the door, staring ahead with glazed eyes. She trudged over to her bed in the center and flopped onto it face first. She lay for a while as Lai watched her, and just as she was about to ask again, Tam lifted her head. "Kwang?" she asked, and then spun her head around to see Kwang's empty bed. "Where is she?" "I don't know. She left a while ago to try and get enough reception to call the university." "How long ago?" Tam scratched her head and got up to inspect Kwang's bed, looking under it for some reason. "I don't know. Not long after you left. How did it go?" "And when did I leave?" Tam scratched her chin and lay back down on her bed. "Pardon? How did it go? They needed your help." She stared at the ceiling and said nothing, instead turning away from Lai and pulling the blanket over herself. "Let's just go to sleep," she sighed, and Lai frowned, her eye on the door. "I can't sleep," she moaned, shifting again. "Believe me, I've been trying since Kwang left. Just try. Good night, Lai. Everything better be fucking normal when we wake up." Lai was a bit surprised and raised her eyebrows. She looked at Tam's back and frowned again, scratching her arm. "You sound like Kwang," she said after a moment. Her friend lay unmoving. "Tam?" "Nothing." She sighed and turned over as well, pulling the blanket up to her shoulder. She thought to replay the day's events in her head, and hopefully bore herself to sleep. But her mind was focused too much as she thought about waking up and packing with Tam, driving to pick up Kwang at her parents' house, heading off for the first leg of their journey. She physically shook the thoughts from her head and focused on the wooden wall beside her bed instead. The creases running up and down and along, the cracks, the crevices. It was too hot. She pushed the blanket off, but it was still too hot, and desperately heating up now. She started to pant, shocked at the sudden change in temperature, and pulled her cardigan off, then her t-shirt as well. She finally stopped panting as she lay and stared at the ceiling in just her sweatpants and sports bra. Her mind was a muddled mess, already forgetting the incident as soon as it was over. She felt cold again and pulled the blanket up to her shoulder, and that was the last thought she had before falling asleep. She woke on a cold floor, slowly blinking her eyes open. The cold of the tiles sent her sensors mad, shooting sharp pains up into every inch of exposed skin. She coughed and scrambled to her feet, still trying to adjust her eyes to the brightness in her inertia. As her vision came into focus, she saw that she was standing in the middle of the university hospital, holding a clipboard, dressed in her usual uniform. Looking around the empty hall, her vision blurred on and off as she shook her head, rattling her brain. She felt her face. It was cold, and her clothes. They were very different than Nurse Chiao's. No golden floral displays, just simple blue scrubs and black jeans. Much less traditional and more practical, as a nurse's outfit should be. She ran her fingers across the fabric and sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. Her eyes shot open as she felt a sudden pinch on her forearm, and with a yelp, she saw that it was her own hand digging fingernails into her arm. She pulled it away and then gently rubbed the incisions she had made on her arm. Incisions? Why had that word come to her head? It would just be a small indentation. She looked closely, and it was indeed an incision. "Oh my God," she said, as blood began to pour out of the cuts. She clasped her other hand over the cuts as blood flowed liberally out of the deep slices and down her arm. Fuck, she breathed, as her vision blurred again. Her breathing became faint. The blood dripped to the tiles, and it echoed about the halls, impossibly loud. The clipboard in her other hand left her mind, and it clattered to the floor. The paper. She bent down and yanked it, tearing off the top page and wrapping it around her gushing arm. As she held it as tight as she could, her eyes drifted down to the clipboard on the floor, the second page staring back up at her. It took her attention. There were large Chinese characters scrawled in the middle of an otherwise blank page. Where had she seen them before? King Zhao? She thought aloud. She felt a shot of pain in her arm and looked, but it felt different. She pulled away the paper, and there were no cuts, no blood. She was still for a moment, before standing and rushing off down the corridor, leaving the torn piece of paper to slowly float to the ground. As she left the corridor, it folded in half and unfolded again. One of its corners was pulled to the middle. Lai ran through the hospital, switching focus between the corridor ahead and her untouched arm. "Someone! Anyone!" she yelled as she ran, eventually running out of breath. She came slowly to a stop in the middle of a hall, bending over to pant. A phone rang to her right, and the sound shocked her to the floor with a shriek. She looked across the corridor, panting harder now, and saw a woman at the reception desk calmly pick up the phone and begin speaking. Lai took a heavy breath and sighed, climbing to her feet and walking over with heavy, defeated steps. She practically fell forward onto the counter and rested her head on it, still panting. The woman looked at her strangely and was silent for a moment. "I'm sorry," she then said through the phone, as Lai waited with her eyes closed. Relief, finally. Yes, thank you, the receptionist said, and hung up the phone. She looked at the top of Lai's head for a moment before asking, "Can I help you?" with a decisively disapproving tone. Lai looked up and smiled. "Yes, please help me," she breathed, clutching her chest. "Okay," the woman said, looking up over her glasses. "And what is it I can help you with?" "This is the university hospital?" Lai asked. "Yes. I'm Lai. I study here. I'm supposed to be on placement now at Tao Hospital in the countryside. My friends are there, and I think there's been a mistake. I think they're in trouble." The woman took a long breath and sighed, and then waited. "And? What is it I can help you with?" Lai looked at the woman, looked closer. "You look familiar," she said quietly, trying to place it. "Well, you said you studied here," the woman snapped. "What is it I can help you with?" she repeated. "Oh, I thought..." Her speaking slowed, and her eyes widened. "What? Will you get to the point? You're wasting my time here, you rude girl." Lai took a step back. "Rude? Me? No, I..." The woman clenched a fist over her mouth. A cockroach was crawling over her shoulder, coming down to her chest. "Yes, you are being quite rude. And talking nonsense." Lai took another step back. A cockroach jumped up onto the counter, and another crawled over the top of the computer monitor. She looked down and saw a group of spiders coming out of the bottom of the counter, tearing through a crack in the tiles. I think..." Her words failed her. "Thank you, miss," she said, as she turned around and started to run down another hallway. Her breathing was irregular, stopping and starting. At one moment, it was heavy and laborious, and at the next it was quick and useless. Her feet started to tangle, and she staggered around the hall like an idiot as she tried to keep steady, keep running. She could hear scuttling behind her, a sliming sound that started to overwhelm her as the bugs chased her down the corridor. Sweat dripped from her forehead and wet the floor below her. She felt her feet losing grip, sliding on the floor, until she finally slipped forward and slammed onto the tiles. Her hands and legs splayed out. She looked at the tiles an inch from her eye, felt them cool her face. She listened out for the insects that followed her, but the hospital was silent once again. Looking over her shoulder, the hallway was empty, and she sighed, pulling herself back to her feet. She panted in the middle of the hall, bent over, but she jumped back up at the sound of a stapler and mumbling. Looking around, she saw a door just slightly cracked ahead of her and tried to turn her body to peek inside. Seeing nothing, Lai tiptoed over to it and tentatively peered through. It was an examination room, and she saw a young woman lying on the bed. Kwang. Seeing her friend lying on the table brought a wave of relief, and Lai shuffled forward, knocking the door with her shoulder and causing it to creak as it opened only a fraction more. She grabbed the door and held it firmly still, holding her breath as silence fell upon the hall again. Footsteps followed, and she let go of the door, opening her mouth to prepare an apology. But she shrunk as she saw a face peer back through the entrance. Dr. Hank squinted at her through the crack in the door, and she almost shrieked at the sight of him. It was him. There was no denying. But how did he... Lai? Kwang's voice came from the room, weak and soft. Is it you? Lai blinked and gulped as Dr. Hank stared at her, his mouth twitching into a grimace. Lai, help me, please. Kwang began to yell, and Dr. Heng grunted and slammed the door shut. Lai whimpered and pulled her courage, stepping forward and grabbing the door handle. But it would not budge. Lai? Are you there? Please. It was not just locked, but the door handle would not move even a fraction of a centimeter. Lai pulled at it with all her strength and banged her balled fist on the obscured window. Lai, please! Oh my God! Kwang's pleas were overshadowed by the roaring sound of an electric saw. Lai, please! Even as Kwang's screams grew louder, so did the saw, and Lai took a step backwards, then another. It could not be. What could not be? She closed her eyes for a second, regained herself. But opening them, she saw blood splatter onto the frosted glass, and she ran down the corridor. She was unsure if it was the same direction that she had just come running from, but it did not matter. She had to get out. Get home. Not just her dorm room, but home to her parents. Oh God. She felt a sickness come to her stomach, like a punch in the gut. What was that? She stopped and almost fell forward, clutching her stomach. Looking to her right, there was nothing. Looking to her left, there was the female bathroom, and she ran through the door. Panting, she came to the sink and bent over, gagging and ready to vomit. But nothing came, and she coughed, wiping spit from her mouth. Looking up at herself, she took a deep breath and let it out. She looked into her eyes, blinking tears away, focusing. Vision blurring, she slapped herself and it jumped into focus. Come on, this is nothing. Looking down her reflection, she saw red on her arm and looked down in real life. Oh God, more blood. It was all over her hands, dried blood from a while ago. But there were no wounds. Above the mirror, the light started to buzz louder and louder. She heard a whistling and whipped her head towards the door. A paper airplane had sailed into the bathroom, and it whooshed and looped towards her as the light buzzed louder, made a fizzling noise. Its pointed tip rammed into her temple as the bulb cracked and blew, and the door swung open and slammed into the wall. The bathroom was shrouded in darkness, but low blue light was coming from outside. Looking to the mirror, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the darkness. It was tall, so fucking tall, and stocky, the deepest black. It stretched up from heavy boots at the floor to a wide-brimmed hat by the ceiling. She gasped and took a long step backwards, pushing through the stall door. Inside, she quietly closed the door and pulled the lock, then placed the lid of the toilet down and climbed up to crouch on top of it. Heavy footsteps came into the bathroom, metal clinking on the tiles, and they stopped in front of her stall. Even in the darkness, she could see below the door 2 thick boots waiting for her. A hefty knock came and made her heaves jitter. Another knock, harder this time, and the door shook on its frame. Another, the lock bending. She covered her eyes and gritted her teeth as the door banged, instinctively leaning away from it, the back of the toilet digging into her spine. She forced her eyes open and looked as the door was struck again, and the lock pinged off. A gush of air blew towards her as it flew open, and Tam stood in front of her, frantic. "Lai!" she yelled, and she grabbed Lai by the arm. Her touch was ice cold. A shattering jolt pulled Lai back onto the flat bed. "Wake up!" came the whispered screech in her ear, and she burst her eyes open to see Tam's face very close to hers, close enough to cause her to flinch away. "God, what is wrong with you? I thought you slept in the car." Lai sat panting at her friend, eyes wide in shock. "What the hell is wrong?" "It's me," Tam whispered, and Lai rubbed her head, blinking. "Sorry, I had a weird dream," Lai said, "and I drove." Tam waved her hand and slapped Lai's arm. "It doesn't matter. Listen to me, Lai. We have to get the hell out of here, right fucking now." Lai squinted and sat up straighter, still trying to wake up. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" "Everything happened. Ever since we got here. She trailed off and checked the door, listening out. We're not supposed to be here, Lai. Or this is exactly where we're supposed to be. She dropped her chin to her chest and swallowed. I don't know which is worse. She stood up and moved over to her bed, looking over it and pushing the blanket aside. I was trying to wake you up for ages, shaking you like mad. How long was I asleep? Lai asked, rubbing her eyes. I don't know. Maybe 5, 6 hours. Maybe longer. What? Lai pulled her hands away. But it felt like 5 minutes. I know, Tam said, turning to stand before her friend. And I can't tell, but I'm pretty sure it's still dark outside. It should be 6 or 7 a.m., but it's pitch black. We're not supposed to be here, Lai, and we need to go. Lai looked away and thought, hard, shaking her head. Tam tapped on her pockets, then looked in her blanket again. Okay, let's go. What are you looking for? Lai asked, as she stood up. Tam stopped and looked at her friend. I don't know. Let's go. They headed for the door, Tam leaning against it and holding up her hand to Lai as she listened. Wind swept through the silent hospital carrying fog. It whistled past the door, through the cracks in the old wood, and as the wind screeched softly past, the sounds coalesced into one sharp whisper, Stay. As the word blew past the door, so did a breeze that blew out the only light in the room. Everything fell black and Lai squealed, digging her fingernails into Tam's shoulder. Jesus! Tam yelled and grabbed the door handle, opening the door and pulling Lai out with her. She slammed it closed behind them, and they stood breathing in the silent corridor, not quite pitch black as the moonlight and fog crept in through the walls. Tam tore Lai's hand from her shoulder and rubbed it as Lai offered a stammered apology. It's fine. Do you remember how we got here? Where did we come from? Lai stood and her brain turned, but Tam could see that it was not working. Wait. She spoke to herself and paced back and forth in the middle of the hall. She pointed in each direction. We came from this way. Came from the cafeteria. From there we were in the contagious area, then the non-contagious, then the doctor's office and the reception, right? She turned to Lai, who nodded after taking a second. You have no idea, do you? It was a confusing path, Lai said. Her voice was softer than usual, becoming reserved as the stakes mounted. Tam stepped away and sighed. It was left up to her. Besides, Lai continued, I was unconscious for part of the tour. Okay, it's fine. We just have to get back to the cafeteria. It wasn't far from here. Then we can find a sign to the contagious area. It'll be fine. We've got this. A hand fell down onto her shoulder, and she pushed it away. Lai, just calm down. We're going to be... But the hand was cold, icy, bony. Tam slowly turned around, and Nurse Chow was standing smiling at her. You, Dr. Help, come, she said, with her signature joy. She held up her hand to take Tam's, but the girl hid it away. No, Tam yelled, and Lai lost her breath, falling back against the wall. We have to go now, nurse. I cannot help you, and my friend and I must go right now. So please take us back to... Nurse Chow placed her cold hands on each of Tam's arms, and her smile was suddenly gone. She stared into Tam's eyes and held tight, then pushed forward. Nurse, Tam began, but she was thrust against the wooden wall and lost her voice. With another push, the wall suddenly fell away behind her, and Nurse Chow let go as she stumbled backwards into another room. The wall spun around and came to a stop, looking just like it had before. Lai blinked at it, and at Nurse Chow, who looked at her with a big smile. You have not eaten, the nurse said, and Lai's senses overloaded her, bombarded her. Flight, flight, flight. Are you hungry? Nurse Chiao made the slightest movement forward, and Lai turned on her heel and fled down the corridor, leaving the woman there to smile on her own. Tam found herself on the floor of a familiar room, blinking at the solid wall that she had just fallen through. Ah, you came Dr. Heng's faint voice behind her. She whipped her head around and saw him holding out a mask for her, which she took without thinking and pulled over her mouth and nose. He kept his hand out to help her up, and she took it, noticing another body on the table. As he looked over some tools and papers, she gulped and tried not to look at the patient. It was a young woman this time, also naked but for a cloth over her groin, and she too had deep lacerations all over her body. Tam covered her mouth and gagged as the smell hit her, and Dr. Heng licked his lips under his mask and put down the papers. "Shall we begin?" he asked, and Tam nodded, then immediately rescinded. "No," she said, pulling the mask off. Dr. Heng was taken aback. Tam had always excelled in her English lessons, but the sweating and panting were hurting her skills, and she could hardly make it through each sentence. "I was trying to say to Nurse Chiao, my friends and I need to go. We can't be here any longer. In fact, I don't think we ever were supposed to come here at all. We're very sorry, and we mean no disrespect. Or no offense. But something is very wrong. And I think it's best if we, please, just go." Dr. Heng stood and hung his head, shrinking back into his shoulders. He lifted his hand to scratch his cheek, and then brought it down to rest on the table, on an instrument. His eyes lifted and bore into the young girl, deep into her. She was trying to appear strong, standing on her toes, and puffing her chest as she spoke loudly and clearly down at him. But as soon as he made eye contact, she dropped to her heels, her posture weakened, her resolve depleted. He smiled under his mask. It moved the rest of his face enough for Tam to tell that he was. "Your friend is not leaving," he said. Tam's eyes burst open, and she took a step back, hitting the wall again. "How?" He cut her off. "Whether she is meant to be here or not." He nodded to the body on the table as he spoke, and then turned away and rubbed his face. He sighed. Tam looked at the table and opened her mouth. "Kwang!" she yelled and rushed over. She leaned down over the body, tapping at her friend's face, trying to pull open her eyes. Once open, they would not close, and Kwang lay still on the table, looking up with an even stiller gaze. "No, no, no, please, Kwang, wake up, please." Tam slapped her friend and shook her by the shoulders as Heng watched, his mouth twitching, his eyes glazing over. His perfectly pronounced words rang through Tam's head. They did not sound at all like he had spoken for the rest of the night. It was clear, confident, malicious. She slowly looked up from her friend's lifeless face and met Heng's eyes. He had his hand clasped over a large scalpel, and he was scowling down at her. "Now I must operate. Will you help me?" he asked. Tam nodded, slowly stood. "Good girl. Now just wait." She walked over the other side of the body, standing behind the doctor, as he picked up the scalpel and leaned over the student, sufficiently calmed. Tam's breaths became heavy, and she tried to control them. She could not look, shifting her eyes about the dark room and focusing on the cracks in the walls, looking for moonlight. She winced as the sound of slicing began to fill the room. She heard the trickling of blood, like the last body. Dr. Heng finished and began to pull and stretch at the girl's chest, as Tam suppressed gags and fidgeted behind him, looking at the door. He turned his head back slightly and said, "The bone saw, please." Now. Tam flinched at his words and then composed herself. She took a step forward, her heart racing, and another step. She found herself at the tray of instruments and ran her fingers along it, keeping her eyes trained on Heng, who was inspecting the inside of Kwang's chest. Her fingers brushed past the ice coldness of the bone saw, and she smiled. Dr. Heng bent over and surveyed the chest, seeing deep cuts and gashes in the broken ribs. He stood up straight to ask Tam again, but there was a wave of air on the back of his neck, and then a sudden sharp pain and a deafening crack. The thrust pushed him forward, and he fell onto the body, his hands flailing around for support, and one of them landing inside. All he could muster was an inhuman "Gah!" as he flapped on the table. Tam shrieked with laughter as she stood behind him, throwing a foot up on the back of his bent knee and leaning as hard as she could on the bone saw. The echoing crack was suddenly overpowered by a long, strained scraping sound, and with each tiny scrape, Dr. Heng's vision jolted and flashed red and white. Tam pushed forward until the bone saw felt like it was about to come loose. Then she clasped her fingers as tight as she could and started to pull back, pushing Heng down with her foot. The scraping continued as she sawed back towards herself, and Heng flailed and babbled below her. She pushed forward again, a jagged and unsteady cut, then pulled back, sawing deeper. Heng's moaning finally stopped, and he was left twitching, spasming out of control. Tam let go and took a lumbering step back, hitting the wall. He rested against the table and convulsed, the saw sticking out of his skull. Tam laughed so hard that she had to brace herself against the wall. But her laughs were cut short by a scream somewhere nearby. Her face became serious. She moved to the door, and taking one last look over her shoulder at Kwang, she opened it and stepped outside. Lai ran right into her in the hall, pushing against the thin door and snapping it off its hinges. Tam caught herself on the wall, and they both remained standing, just barely. Lai tried to speak, out of breath, but Tam put her finger against her friend's mouth, and their breathing fell silent. She listened out, hearing cooing and giggling from somewhere down the dark corridor. "We need to find Kwang," Lai finally heaved out, but Tam pressed her mouth again. "Kwang is gone. We need to run, and we can't stop running. Okay?" Lai blinked and took a calming breath. "Okay, girls," Nurse Chow screeched down the hall. "Come, eat." Tam grabbed Lai's hand and pulled her along the hallway as the nurse's silhouette floated into the hall behind them. Their thin slip-on shoes did not quite produce loud footsteps, but the fear and the determination imbued in them echoed throughout every hall of the hospital. Lai was a rag doll in Tam's hands, dragged along behind like an afterthought. At least, that was how she felt, as Tam held as tight as she could, ready to die with her friend if they could not both escape. Lai constantly looked behind them, but could not see Nurse Chiao, only hear her cackle and growl as she pursued them. Tam began to lose her breath, and her vision started to flash white around the edges. Her heart started to sting with each pound. With each inhale, her throat burned. The hall was pitch black ahead. She could not see the path, if there even was one. Suddenly, a corner came into view, and she dug her heels into the floorboards to stop them from slamming into it. She quickly turned it, swinging Lai in a wide arc behind her, and saw another dark corridor ahead. But this time, there was a door to their immediate right. Without thinking, she ran for the room, pushing them both inside and closing the door as silently as possible. It seemed to be a supply cupboard, and Lai found herself being pushed into a soft rack of nurses' and doctors' outfits. Tam stood hunched against the door, pressing her ear so hard to the thin wood that it almost ripped a hole through it. She heard what she sought, Nurse Chiao's erratic giggles, but could not hear footsteps. Turning her head scratched her cheek against the splintering, foul-smelling wood, but it was necessary to peer through a crack in the door and see the dark corridor. For a moment there was nothing, not even laughter, but then the glowing figure of Nurse Chiao sailed past the door and continued on down the corridor. Tam released her breath and laughed to herself as Lai remained still and quiet. "Oh, thank God," Tam panted and leaned back against the clothes. "Okay, let's take a moment to catch our breath," she said, and Lai nodded. She stared at her friend as she wheezed. "What happened to Kwang?" she asked. Tam gulped and looked Lai in the eye, frowning. A tear formed. "Lai, I'm sorry. She—" A hand pushed through the clothes and clasped itself over Tam's mouth. As another hand burst out and wrapped around her waist, another grabbed her arm. After a second of muffled screams, they all pulled, and Tam disappeared into the line of dusty clothes, her feet sinking away before Lai's eyes. Lai stood frozen, her heart pounding, watching the place where Tam had just been. Her body shook, and the edge of a cheongsam brushed her exposed lower back, causing her to gasp and jump forward. She wheeled around and watched the clothes, then the clothes to her left, waiting for movement. Nothing came except a cold chill, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt behind her for the door handle and twisted it, pulling the door open and disappearing back into the hallway in one swift motion. She stood panting in the hallway for a second, and then closed her eyes and took a long, deep breath in. Holding it for a few seconds, she finally set it free, and the fog pooling around her dispersed a little. She shifted her eyes down the hallway, and then up the other way, and without a thought, she began to run. A triptych of footsteps began behind her as soon as she made off. Heavy, brutal footsteps, some lighter ones, and a distinct lack of them. The halls were filling with fog as she blinked her way through it. The sweat dripping from her kept her freezing cold through the night in her exposed clothes. Nurse Chiao's laughter floated up from behind, but it bounced around the maze of the hospital's halls and sometimes seemed to be coming from ahead or right in Lai's ear. Mr. K's metal footsteps were soon joined by the chilling scrape of his axe along the floor behind him. "Little future," Dr. Heng shouted in his faint muster, his voice now strained by the saw in his brain. "You cannot escape. You cannot run. This is where you belong." Lai almost looked over her shoulder, almost shouted back in response, but she pinched her arm and kept her eyes trained forward. No blood leaked out of impossible incisions in her arm. It was real as it could be. She threw one foot in front of the other until her feet became sweaty and her slippers almost tripped up-ended her. She kicked them off her feet without stopping, leaving the pair of them behind her. There was no time to look back. The only way was forward. Splinters stuck into her soles, but the only way was forward. Even when the fog was so thick that she could feel it pushing against her, the only way was forward. She came to a door and stopped. The contagious area. She almost could not open the door, but she gritted her teeth and pushed it anyway, slamming it shut behind her. Keeping her eyes closed, she rushed ahead down the path to the next room. The moans slowly rose around her, and with them, the scuttling, squeaking, sloshing of the insects. Her eyes were closed, but she could see them in her head, crawling into mouths, picking at scabs tearing out of gashes. She gagged and tripped over something, but held her hands out to steady herself, picking up the pace. She walked for 10 seconds, then faltered and walked 10 more, then stopped. It would not let her do it like this. She heard a bang on the door behind her, perhaps an axe. Damn it. Her eyelids slowly lifted, and she found that the room was so dark that she could hardly see the bodies on the floor, or the things creeping all over them. Another bang came, a crack appearing up the middle of the door that was right at her back. She took a breath and waltzed along the middle of the room, coming to the next door in a blink. She twisted the knob and pushed it open, entering the non-contagious area. She closed the door behind her and saw all of the bodies in the room turn their dark heads towards her and began to moan. She steeled herself and crossed the room, but as she reached the middle, she heard the door bang already. No time. She darted to the left and fell to the floor, tucked between 2 tight figures. Rolling herself around, the thick, cold, black muck all over them smeared onto her, and she scooped it off her stomach with an eager cupped hand, bringing it up to smother on her face. The door crashed again and snapped off its frame, slamming to the floor. Lai felt the bodies next to her shuffle and try to roll off her, but she grabbed their arms and held them in place. This made them moan louder, and she heard a grunt from the door. Heavy footsteps followed and trudged to the center of the room, then fell silent. The entire room was shuffling a little now, the mass of patients becoming a sea of thrashing groans, like they had before, to terrify the students. Lai smiled now, covered in muck and sweat, when she had almost hyperventilated and run from the room before. As Mr. Kei continued to grumble, Lai heard as Heng and Qiao pushed past him in the middle of the path, bickering in Chinese. Mr. Kei grunted his answer with anger as Heng's footsteps left the room, and presumably, Nurse Qiao followed behind them. The door out of the area closed, but Lai could still feel the axeman's presence and hear his heavy, impatient breaths. The moans in the room grew even louder, and he made a low growling sound and stepped forward. He was silent as he lifted his axe above his head, but he yelled as he thrust it down. The poor patient was probably too incapacitated to even feel the axe coming, and their life was cut out with a final yelp and a squelch of metal and flesh. Lai closed her eyes to brace, her breath becoming hot when she heard what had happened. A soft fog began to pour into the room through the cracks in the walls. Perhaps the hospital was impressed. Lai held tight and kept perfectly still as Mr. K.E. pulled his axe from the innocent and took another couple steps. The moaning had grown steadily, now filling the large room and echoing around. Mr. K's grunts grew more frequent, more angered, and his steps reckless. He trudged back and forth, growling and lifting, then dropping his axe. He stood on one of the patient's legs, the crack of their bones ripping through the wall of howling, and as they screamed, he thrust his axe down into them. He screamed back and pulled his axe out, throwing it back down at the next patient, and soon all of the bodies were writhing and crying with concern. He took another step into the bodies and crushed the appendage of the man next to Lai, eliciting a squeal. Mr. K.E. gave a final yell and lifted his axe as high as he could, squinting over his beak through the fog, and thrust his axe down. Lai grabbed the weak body beside her and pulled it, rolling it on top of her as the axe came down. She pushed it off as the axe sunk into the wood with a thud, and Mr. K.E. roared in anger as he tried to pull the axe out of the floor, but failed. She darted forward and slid up in front of him, his beak almost touching the top of her head. She stared directly up into his glass eyes as he tore the axe out of the floor and raised it above his head. The difference in height was so stark that she almost wavered, but she heard him smile behind the mask, and she smiled back as she thrust her hand forward and hit his throat hard where his mask stopped. He choked and took a step back, letting go of the axe to clutch his neck, and tripped over an extended blackened arm. Lai took a step back as he tumbled backwards, and his huge frame hit the floor with a brutal thud. The impact forced one final cough from his throat before the axe followed him down, and with a wet thunk, entered his chest. The moans around became more frantic, but Lai ignored them and looked at the door. She felt the urge to smile. Pride crept into her thoughts, so she took a deep breath and released it, heading for the door. She opened it, but stopped. Damn it. She looked over her shoulder at the sea of patients writhing on the floor, waiting for help. "I'm sorry," she said in Vietnamese, and walked through the door. She walked with determination. Hope, or the promise of escape, could not interfere. She clenched her fists into white knuckles, ready to strike anyone who jumped out of the thick fog all around her, for whatever good it would do. But nothing happened as she walked down the hall, and she stopped as a large double door came into view through the fog. She tried the handle, but it would not open, so she gritted her teeth and turned back to get the axe. "Wait," came an old voice from her right. She stopped and turned, narrowed her eyes at herself, reflected on a glass pane. Looking past, she saw in the faint light the figure of a short old man hunched over. His skin shone like wax. His clothes were too pristine to be real personal effects. The golden plaque below him displayed a familiar set of characters. Director. "Yes, little future," he rasped, holding a hand up to the glass. "Please do not leave. We need you. You belong here." Lai sucked her teeth and tilted her head at the silhouette. "You know something is wrong here. I can explain it all to you, but you must not leave. I beg you." Lai sighed, and her restless fingers danced. "It is your destiny, Lai. It has been this way for centuries." She looked the way she had come, then at the door, and shook her head. She extended an arm out of his view and wrapped her fingers around the golden handle of the sword hanging beside his window. The glass was suddenly gone, and with one foul swoop, she thrust forward and skewered the director through the middle. Lai opened the driver door and threw her suitcase onto the passenger seat. She sat down and closed the door, trapping some fog inside the car. The engine burst to life, and the headlights pierced the mist. She drove. The fog swept away along each side of the car as it tore through, driving the speed limit and never dropping below. She stared dead ahead at the obscured road the entire time, making no head checks, indulging no curiosities. After 4 minutes, she noticed that the fog had lifted. Pulling the car to a stop in the middle of the road, she could see clearly all around. She took a deep breath and looked in the rearview mirror, and even the path behind was clear of fog. A hand left the steering wheel and gripped the gear shift, almost moved. But she looked in the mirror at the road behind. Would the hospital even be there if she went back? The hand lifted, rested on the wheel again. One final look in the mirror, and the girl drove on. The end.